Hello, and welcome to Cyber Risk Management in Practice. In this video, we're starting the risk assessment phase, what many consider the heart of a cyber risk management program. Why? Because this is where potential risks are not just discussed in abstract terms, but identified, analyzed, and described in a way the organization can understand and act on. This phase becomes the bridge between what we've learned so far about the organization and what we're going to do about it. And something to keep in mind is that the risk assessment step is not the whole risk management process, even though many people treat it like it is. It's a critical piece, but it works best when it builds on a well-defined context and flows into effective treatment, communication, and ongoing review. Done well, the risk assessment creates structure. It gives us a clear way to describe risks, understand them, and decide how to respond. In the book, we break this phase into three distinct but connected parts. Risk identification, spotting the actual risks the organization faces based on its operations, environment, and current situation. Risk analysis, evaluating how likely those risks are and how much impact they could have. Risk characterization, describing each risk in a way that reflects the organization's strategy, risk appetite, and decision-making needs. These steps aren't meant to be rushed. They involve technical insight, business awareness, and collaborative thinking because the outcome isn't just a list of risks. It's the starting point for decisions about priorities, resources, and actions. And this part of the process is where your work becomes visible to others, especially leadership. This is where stakeholders start to rely on your outputs to guide strategy and investment. That's why how you approach risk assessment matters. Not just the techniques, but the mindset and the clarity you bring into each step. So it's time to begin the first step of the risk assessment process, risk identification. This is not the time to go back and gather more data. That work was done in the previous phase. Now you're using what you've learned to identify where cyber risks exist in the organization based on how things actually function. And the key to doing that well is to work with structure and focus. Start by defining the scope of your assessment. You're not trying to find every possible risk across the entire organization. You're looking at a particular business process, a technology stack, a department, something specific and relevant. From there, begin breaking that area down. What are the key systems, assets, and data flows involved? Where does the process rely on people, tools, vendors, or interdependencies? And most importantly, what would happen if one of those things failed, was compromised, or became unavailable? These are the types of questions that move you from raw context to actionable risks. And remember, you're not starting from scratch here. You already have interviews, documentation, architecture models, technical reports, all the context you need. Risk identification is about interpreting that information, not collecting more. You're looking for scenarios where a threat, a vulnerability, and a potential impact align. If any one of those is missing, it's not yet a risk, just a concern or exposure to monitor. This process works best when it's deliberate. Walk through the flow of the process or system. Look at each step and ask, where could this go wrong? What might cause that? And how would it affect the organization? You're identifying risks that are realistic, specific, and clearly connected to the business, not abstract threats or laundry lists pulled from a generic template. With your scope defined and your understanding of the environment in place, you're ready to apply techniques that help uncover the risks that matter. And this part works best when it's not done in isolation. Cyber risk isn't something a single person or team can map alone. It touches technology, business operations, vendors, legal, finance, and people. That's why involving others across functions and levels is essential. Different teams bring different insights. IT might understand system dependencies. Legal might flag exposure to regulatory risk. Operations might surface gaps in day-to-day execution. And risk leaders bring the structure that ties it all together. So what methods actually help here? First, you describe risks through risk scenarios. These aren't just vague concerns, they're structured narratives that reflect real world possibilities. Each scenario captures a potential cause, the affected systems or processes, and the consequences if it materializes. You also introduce threat modeling. This involves mapping out how a system or process works, then asking, what could go wrong here? What threats might exploit weaknesses? And what would the impact be? Threat modeling doesn't have to be overly technical. You can use process flows, architecture diagrams, or business narratives. The goal is to see risk where function and technology meet. Alongside these, you can use complementary techniques like brainstorming, structured sessions where teams identify risk together, guided by a facilitator, interviews and surveys, especially helpful when dealing with distributed teams or highly specialized areas. Checklists to prompt thinking based on known categories of risk, like those tied to compliance, cloud security, or third-party exposure. Audit reports and testing, these often surface risks that teams have become blind to, gaps in access control, misconfigurations, or weaknesses in response. You can also draw from supporting models like the cyberkill chain, which helps explore the steps an attacker might take, or attack trees, which map out different paths to the same negative outcome. No single method is perfect. What matters is using the right mix in a way that makes sense for your context. And as always, structure matters. Each identified risk should be captured in a way that others can understand and evaluate later. A clear title, a concise description, affected areas, potential causes, and likely consequences. But here's something else to keep in mind. The value doesn't just come from the methods you choose. It comes from the people you bring into the process. There's a reason risk identification works better when it includes multiple voices. When people from different parts of the organization come together, sharing their views, challenging assumptions, and filling in the gaps, we get closer to what's really going on. It's what we often refer to as the wisdom of crowds. Not crowdsourcing in a chaotic sense, but structured collaboration across disciplines. So you're not relying on one person's view, one team's language, or one narrow interpretation of what could go wrong. That collective input is what makes risk identification credible, and it's what gives you a strong foundation to move into the next phase. Now that we've identified the risks that matter through collaboration, structured thinking, and real context, it's time to move into the next step, risk analysis. This is where we begin to assign meaning to the risks we've uncovered. The purpose of risk analysis is to understand how likely each risk is to occur and how severe the impact would be if it did. You're not trying to predict the future, you're working to create clarity. And it starts by defining the dimensions you'll use to evaluate. In the book, you walk through a number of impact categories that help paint a more complete picture. Financial. This might include direct losses, fines, legal fees, or revenue disruption. Operational. Think outages, downtime, loss of critical services, or interruption to workflows. Legal and regulatory. Penalties, litigation, non-compliance, or license issues. Reputational. Loss of customer trust, negative press, or brand damage. Safety or environmental. Depending on your industry, these risks can lead to injury, environmental harm, or regulatory consequences tied to safety standards. The point here is that risk isn't one-dimensional. What looks minor in one area may have major effects elsewhere. That's why your risk analysis needs to account for multiple types of impact, not just the most obvious ones. Then comes likelihood. Rather than defaulting to vague scales, you're encouraged to define what each level of likelihood means in your organization. Is it based on frequency, historical incidents, threat intelligence? Make it specific so the analysis is repeatable and the reasoning behind your scoring is transparent. Throughout this process, consistency matters. Whether you use a 3-point or 5-point scale, the key is that everyone understands what the levels mean and how they're applied. This isn't just about assigning numbers, it's about creating a shared understanding of risk severity. And it's worth noting, risk analysis doesn't need to be highly quantitative from the start, but it does need to be meaningful. And it sets you up for future steps, especially if you want to move toward financial modeling or cost-based prioritization later. After identifying risks and analyzing their likelihood and impact, the final step in the assessment process is risk characterization. This is where everything you've worked on, scope, context, identification, and analysis comes together to support actual decisions. In this step, you place each risk in relation to your organization's risk appetite, tolerance, and capacity, concepts we introduced back in Chapter 1. You're not just evaluating risk in isolation. You're asking, is this something the organization is prepared to accept? Or is it something that requires treatment, investment, or escalation? And this is also where prioritization becomes clearer. Some risks might fall comfortably within appetite, meaning no further action is needed. Others might exceed tolerance or approach capacity, and those are the ones that will demand attention. But characterization isn't only about thresholds. It also includes strategic, legal, and cultural context. Is this risk already on leadership's radar? Does it relate to a critical process or a key vendor? Could it affect regulatory status or public trust? By surfacing these dimensions, you make the risk assessment more actionable, something the business can use to shape priorities, funding, and response. And here's an important point. Try to go beyond just setting qualitative levels like low, medium, or high. Where you can, set actual values. Estimate financial cost ranges. Quantify potential downtime. Include indirect effects like long-term reputation damage or lost market position. That level of clarity sets you up for quantitative analysis later and helps leadership understand the true weight of what's at stake. So while this step might look simple on paper, risk characterization is where the assessment starts turning into action. It helps teams focus. It helps leaders decide. And it ensures your work as a risk practitioner moves the organization forward. If this approach resonates with you, there's a lot more discussed in the book. Find your copy and embark on this journey with me, improving your cyber risk management program step by step with a practical approach.